Okay, welcome everyone to the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. My name is Anthony Costello. Today we are going to be talking about Iran. We're going to be discussing the war in Iran, and we're going to be talking about it within the context of Christian realism and Christian just war theory. There's been a lot of speculation and a lot of commentary about Iran in Christian circles. And in my opinion, a lot of it has been rather poor commentary. So to offset some of this, I've asked Tim Milosch, a lecturer of political science at Biola University, and Keith Pavlischek, a former U.S. Marine, who's also lectured and written extensively on just war theory, Christian realism, and global terrorism, to join us today so that we can unpack this issue. Not just, we're going to certainly apply this to Iran. We're going to get to Iran, but we want to talk about just war theory in general and Christian thinking, contemporary thinking on the issue of war, especially since the explicit rise of global terrorism. So, gentlemen, it's good to have you on. Thank you for joining us today. If you want, we'll just go around real quick and you can say something about what you do, where you work, and especially as it applies to your work on this issue of Christian just war theory. So, Tim, why don't we start with you, and then we'll get to Keith.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Tony. I'm really excited to have this discussion with you guys. As Tony said, I'm a lecturer in political science at Biola University, where I also direct the instructional design team, and we help build all the online programs and everything. But relevant to this conversation, I'm also a contributing editor at Providence Magazine, foremost publication on Christian realism, and a great place where some of these discussions continue. I've also published articles on the Middle East. That was what I studied in my undergraduate and graduate degrees. I got my doctorate at Claremont Graduate University, where I studied political philosophy and international relations, did a lot of work, published work on Middle East and American foreign policy in that region. And then I teach courses at Biola that focus primarily on national security, foreign policy, those topics. And then because I really can't stop reading and writing and thinking about that stuff, I also podcast and write on Substack at Tim Talks Politics.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, Tim. Okay, Keith, what about yourself?
I'm an old retired guy, but I like to tell people I spent 30 years in the Marine Corps. I retired in 2007, and that was a mix of active duty and reserve time, and that's half of my life, and the other half of my life was getting advanced degrees in theology, apologetics from Westminster Seminary, and then I got my PhD in a program that was called Religion, Ethics, and Society, where I focused mainly on what would be called political theology or political theory back in the day, spending a lot of time with John Rawls. Which seems so obsolete now, doesn't it? But I kept, I taught at what's now Truman State University in the philosophy and religion department. And while I was there, I got pulled out and sent to Desert Storm. And 10 years later, I was running a nonprofit program for Christian graduate students called Civitas for PhD students. And 9/11 happened. I had been promoted to colonel in 2000, and I thought it was the end of the road. I was about ready to pull the ripcord, and they brought me back in. And so I spent the last 5 years, from 2002 to 2007, back on active duty, working at strategic level intelligence planning. Did a tour in Iraq, and then finally retired out of the Office of Director of National Intelligence. Now I just go through all that because on the one hand, I've got a certain amount of experience in military operations and strategy and planning and that kind of thing, or non-planning when it came to Iraq, but also my academic writing for the past 25 has been exclusively related to issues on military ethics and just war theory. And
Great.
And trying to apply that and spending time trying to explain some of these basic theological notions of just war, Christian understanding of statecraft to the Christian audience in particular.
Yeah, that's great. And that's this really why I wanted to have you two on here, because you guys have, it's Keith, with your experience, and both you guys have expended so much intellectual time and effort on this topic. And myself, just a much briefer stint in the military, just 5.5 years, mainly with the 82nd Airborne Division and one tour in Afghanistan. It's disheartening. It's disheartening for me to see some of the commentary that comes out of our otherwise conservative churches, and from people that are considered oftentimes sort of leaders of the church, right? And it could be out of, one doesn't want to ascribe usually malicious intent. It could be, things could be out of a good-hearted place, but it does seem to be an area where the church is woefully misinformed or underinformed, and is not thinking nearly as clearly on issues like war, just war, and global terrorism as it really needs to be a proper sort of prophetic voice in the culture. So it's good to have you guys on. The term Christian realism has come up 2 or 3 times right now. So maybe we should start there and try and unpack that concept for the audience. Whoever wants to jump in and start, let's talk about Christian realism first.
Yeah, I can take a first stab at it, and Keith, you fill in, because you've had a much longer time working on these topics. So Christian realism, and that's really kind of like the editorial frame for Providence, where Keith and I have both written. And so Christian realism is a framework for thinking about international relations and foreign policy through the lens of Christian theology and philosophy. It was first articulated by Reinhold Neibuhr in the mid-20th century. And Neibuhr is one of those guys who probably should be revisited by a lot of evangelical Christians. At one time,
I have his book somewhere around here.
He's got, and I will confess, I need to revisit him. I'm familiar with his Christian realist framework. I have not read any of his book length stuff. I need to make time for that, because his biography is fascinating. He starts as a socialist pacifist, what today we would probably call a progressive Christian. Yeah. Around the 1920s and 30s, and the rise of Nazism in Europe, the rise of the Stalinism in the Soviet Union, the emergence of World War II, like that just breaks him. And he realizes he has to confront the problem of evil. And he realizes that his socialist pacifism version of Christianity just has no answer for it. And that starts him on an incredible intellectual journey that I think is probably one of the most honest journeys a public intellectual has ever taken in America, and lands him in this place of Christian realism, where he becomes an ardent Cold Warrior, preaches against the evils of communism and global communism, and backs a more certainly preaches against the evil of Nazism, and backs a forceful response to it. I mean, it's a pretty remarkable turnaround. So anyway, his Christian realism framework attempts, the way I've framed it in past writings, is it attempts to sanctify or baptize what's considered classical realism, which is mostly the power politics as usually attributed to Machiavelli, with a real focus on recognizing the problem of evil in the world, and that requires a certain forceful response to defend the good against the encroachments of the evil, and then 2, he adds to that also a somewhat Augustinian view of human nature, the fallenness of the imago Dei, the flawedness of human nature. So he maps those things onto what would generally be considered classic realism, and from there then brings in the just war theory that that is kind of become synonymous with Christian realism in a lot of ways. Although, as we were talking about earlier, there are kind of like Catholic and Protestant variations of that and how we understand that. But that's the broad strokes. Keith, I'll let you fill in.
The one I've written an article on Reinhold Neibuhr that is appreciative of the fact that he's not a pacifist, but I tend to go after Neibuhr because Neibuhr always remained an old style pacifist liberal who, and this is part of the problem, is that he was not he rejected just war theory because he thought it was a sectarian Catholic doctrine. Let me preface what I have to say about Neibuhr's Christian realism, because I do think Christians would do well to read him. To start with his essay, Why the Christian Church is Not Pacifist, which I think is a marvelous takedown and destruction of the sort of liberal, optimistic pacifism that took hold of the mainline church in the social gospel era, right? And it was in reaction to World War I, and the whole mainline church was moving towards a pacifist notion. And what happened in the 1930s? People like Neibuhr look over and say, "Oh, we got the Nazis goose-stepping. Now what are we going to do?" Another peace and treaty against the Nazis isn't going to work. And so he was mugged by reality in the 1930s, as we say.
Right.
The problem,
a lot of people, that's good. That's right.
The problem with Neibuhr is that he read the New Testament and he continued to read it as a pacifist. And he said, Jesus wants us all to be pacifists, but we have to be realists. That's not the just war tradition. The just war tradition does not. Now, this will require me to begin to discuss the exegetical issues at stake, right? And that's why at Providence Magazine we did frame Christian realism as a more contemporary response to Christian pacifism of Yoder and Hauerwas and Richard Hayes, right? So in that sense, right, we were very consciously wanted to be the modern outlet that was doing what Neibuhr was doing with Christianity in Crisis. So that may be more history than your audience needs to know. And then I'll finally say that among my friends and Christian realist colleagues, I'm a Paul Ramsey guy because Paul Ramsey was a great Princeton social ethics and theologian who I think looked at the tradition, was the first Protestant to really look at the history of the just war tradition and begin to work that out in the 60s and 66. So yes, Christian realism, but there's some serious, and in fact, a lot of us are triggered or identified as a more orthodox, Christian orthodox version of the kind of thing that Neibuhr was talking about in the 30s in terms of, by orthodoxy, more biblically orthodox within the Protestant tradition.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Yeah. So you guys said a lot of things there. So, okay. So, that's interesting with regards to Neibuhr. And I haven't read much of him. I just read, what's the one book? Something Man in Society or something. I can't, it's probably from his more progressive socialist period. I think it's one of the early
Moral Man and Immoral Society.
That's right. Moral Man and Immoral Society. And, I just taught a chapter on, these late 19th century philosophers like Herbert Spencer, Bergson, you know, these sort of evolutionists who I think, you know, we're seeing taking Darwinian evolution and applying it to the realm of social ethics and just assuming this kind of continual progression of man, right? This was sort of this Hegelian idea that now is sort of getting baked into a lot of the continental thinkers. And I wonder if Niebuhr wasn't sort of influenced in that direction early on. You know, history is progressing, man is progressing, morally progressing in the same way that biology is evolving. And then World War I and World War II, of course, ended the dreams. And those philosophers are really fallen out of favor. Well, and Peter Kreeft makes the point that it definitely in part because of what happened at the beginning of the 20th century.
Well, Neibuhr is very explicit about we cannot take the empty tomb literally. You know, all the great Christian doctrines. Now, this is why Neibuhr is tricky, right?
Yeah,
right.
He's a modernist in that sense.
Absolutely. You know, I believe in the resurrection, but it's the symbol for the dialectical relation between time and eternity. It's that stuff. That's you know, and in fact, the reason I know Neibuhr as well as I did because my PhD comprehensive exam, I was tasked in 2 weeks to write. I was tasked to write an essay comparing James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and Reinhold Niebuhr's understanding of religious liberty, right? And so I dived into Neibuhr because I never had that at Westminster or any place, you know, and I had read the Nature and Destiny of Man, which is his those Gifford lectures, and it became clear to me that there were some issues here. And then as over the years, what I came to understand about Neibuhr was that Christians who were in international relations, you know, really good guys that were trying to figure things out, and they weren't pacifists, but they couldn't figure out how to be Christians and be involved in international relations at the same time. They jump on Neibuhr because Neibuhr is easy to understand. Nature and Destiny of Man, not so much, right? But you start to get into this stuff and they find, it's like Niebuhr's the guy, you know. And I had one friend who taught at Wheaton. He said, I just can't understand Paul Ramsey. Paul Ramsey's dense and he's theological. So IR guys have a hard time doing the systematic theology because they want to know what does this have to do with anything. So
they have a hard time doing political philosophy too, but
yeah, that's fair. I think, yeah. So I just want to. I always send out this word of caution. Yes, read Neibuhr, but understand when Neibuhr comes out and he recovers the doctrine of original sin. Now, how bad does the theological environment have to be when he comes out and he says, "Yeah, we need to think about original sin"?
Yeah,
it's really bad. Right. You know, it's really bad, and there's sociology involved here. Even the fundamentalist church goes underground. Nobody's paying attention to them.
Right.
Roman Catholics are brilliant, but they're like in their little Thomist
bubbles or whatever.
Bubbles, right? And Neibuhr comes along, and in Nature of Destiny Man's mocks Catholic just war theory, right? And so that's my caution. But if you want to see how somebody really takes on that sort of optimistic pacifism of the day, you could do a lot worse than going back to Reinhold Niebuhr.
I would just comment on that, Keith. It does speak to the influence of Neibuhr that he is put up there with Jefferson and Madison for your comprehensive exams in your doctoral program, because like no one reads this guy anymore. Like I only found out about him when I was first invited to write for Providence, and I was like, who's this Neibuhr guy? And I'm like reading about him. And so to your point, like people who are scholars in international relations, Christians trying to think seriously about that, I totally understand that dynamic. And so you encounter him first as a Christian commentator on a field that doesn't have a lot of explicitly Christian commentators. You don't think about him so much as a theologian. And so you kind of just like engage with him on that level. And so all that to say, like, I think you're on the right track here.
I mean, the guy was a theologian.
No, he was.
Well,
he was.
he brought Bonhoeffer over for a year to New York, didn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, we could have a long conversation about that someday too. Yeah.
Well, I imagine that if probably at this point, if any Neibuhr is read, it's probably Richard. For at least the one book that he wrote, Christ and Culture, which is much more of a theological work than anything political.
Yeah.
Although it's tangential to politics, but yeah.
Well, there's an anecdote, by the way, about Richard Neibuhr is writing all these books, and there's a story about one of Richard's student who's Richard's at Yale, and he's more orthodox than his brother, but the student went up to him and said, "How come you've got one book and your brother's got all these books out?" And Richard says, "It's because I think before I write."
It's good. Yeah.
That's a good caution to any intellectual.
All right. So that's okay. Well, a little bit of a deep dive into Neibuhr there. Now, so there's a sort of realism. Well, okay. He's trying. There's as you said, the theological context is so bad that, Reinhold Niebuhr has to come and say, hey, we need to think about original sin more or again, to show what has been lost there. And I think that probably does relate somehow to these evolutionary schemas of the late 19th and early 20th century, and the kind of philosophizing or Hegelian kind of theology that was being done. And that has done so much damage, I would say. Okay, but so now that would be a Christian realism. You did mention more of a Machiavelian realism that would be sort of outside the, I think what we'd say outside the Christian thinking about politics and war, right? And then we've got pacifism. And, in one of your articles, Keith, you mentioned sort of, you sort of mentioned three views broadly, right? One would be the Machiavelian realism, right? Which obviously goes back to Machiavelli. And then pacifism. And you sort of give two types of pacifism in that article. And then the classical just war theory. So maybe let's discuss these kind of three approaches to war that you lay out in the article. I don't have the title of that article in front of me. But you can remind us.
Just and Unjust War in an Age of Terrorism? No.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, I didn't spend a whole lot of time with Machiavellian realism, but I mean, it could just be called, I don't know, blackball realism or whatever. But the
classical
idea,
realism.
Yeah, that there are no moral considerations or ethical considerations in the use of force. It's simply nothing more than extension of domestic and foreign politics, and that there are no constraints on war. You can get away with.
Right.
And
so might makes right. Basically.
Yeah.
View.
More or less. And there may be more complex claims to that if Tim would want to discuss that more. But I don't spend much time with that because I simply assume that Christians, for whatever reason, don't want to adopt that, or aren't tempted by that, or the just war tradition is not, that I want to defend, it is not rejects it, is not it's not a challenge to the just war tradition, or it's not infiltrating it or whatever. I think so. Yeah. So my focus has been, for the last several decades, is to try to make clear how just war tradition is different from what I call classical pacifism, or the pacifism of the peace churches.
Right. Tim, do you want to say anything about the Machiavelian realism or whatever?
I think I'll just add. I think I'll just add this, because I agree with Keith that it doesn't really threaten the just war theory. It is, and I agree that like Christian scholars who take this seriously are going to look at classical realism and just say that's just a bridge too far. Like that, the idea that there's no moral enterprise in war, and yet somehow there's a moral property to politics, but then classical realism says war is an extension of politics. Like that's just incompatible. So if war is an extension of politics, and if politics is a moral enterprise, then war necessarily has a moral dimension. So you just kind of like reject classical realism on its face from a just war standpoint. What I will say though is that classical realism, as it's articulated in the contemporary era, particularly in like the post 9/11 era, has, I think, contributed to a ongoing view of Christian thought as being primarily pacifist, and this is particularly in the secular space, not just in the Christian space. And so it helps develop this idea that Christianity does not have anything to contribute to discussions on war or foreign policy or military ethics. And that's deeply concerning, especially in a world of more asymmetrical gray zone conflict where practical wisdom and the ethical thinking of Christianity has a ton to contribute. And so it's kind of contributed to silencing Christian thought in this space at a really critical point. And so that's something that I talk about a lot with my students. One of the books that I would recommend people take a look at as a great example of this kind of like false bifurcation, or this false choice between classical realism and pacifism for Christian thinkers, is Robert Kaplan's Warrior Ethics. Was that Warrior Politics? And Robert Kaplan is this, diehard realist. He really thinks in terms of the classical realism. And Warrior Politics is where he basically says the wars of the 21st century require a Machiavelian realism in contrast to Christian ethics. I mean, he makes that very explicit distinction. Christian ethics are more pacifist, and we're just not going to live in a pacifist age. So we need to develop. And he actually says Machiavelli is this kind of like proto-pagan. So you're going to like this, Tony, because you've been doing a lot on neo-paganism. Yeah. You want to see where this applies in the foreign policy space? Look at Kaplan and Warrior Politics.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting. So so it's been sort of. Classical realism is sort of, or classical realists are setting up this false dichotomy, the false choice of something like, hey, realpolitik, and then the extension thereof, which war, it's all is fair in love and
in the
war.
complex world of the gray zone and 21st century conflict. That and then is going to make a simpler ethical framework. And our argument is that's not going to make, not only is that not going to make it simpler, it's actually going to make it's actually going to lead to a level of inhumanity and conflict that I don't think we're really ready for.
Because then anything understood as Christian ethics is treated as pacifistic.
Yes, and that's where the fingers are pointing at us. By which I mean Christians who actually do make those pacifistic assumptions, which is why an argument needs to be made about why the just war tradition is not pacifist, and it's not even crypto-pacifist. One
of the best books I've read on this was Nigel Bigger's book, Defense of War, which almost inspired me to try and get into a program with him. to write on this, but yeah, that book, and he starts with Neibuhr, I think, in that book. And then, of course, he goes through, I think, Yoder, Hauerwas, and Hayes. He ends with Hayes, actually, who we mentioned earlier, as maybe providing the most robust exegetical argument for pacifism. But maybe we'll get
let me just say something again here. Remind me, I wrote for Philosophia Christi back in 2000, I co-authored with Jim Skillen an article, a critique of Richard Hayes. So
of the moral vision of the New Testament. Yeah. And in fact, this is a good entry into pacifism, or modern forms of pacifism. Modern forms. Okay, so so let's do this. So we've talked about classical realism, Machiavelian realism. Okay, we're setting that aside. That's going to be sort of out of bounds, obviously, for the Christian thinker who wants to apply a Christian ethic to the issue of war and conflict, violent conflict. So we have classical just war theory, but then we have these modern versions of Christian pacifism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And Keith, this is where you've spent a lot of time on this. Let's get into this.
So
this conflict.
Whenever I give a somewhat popular talk or lecture on just war theory, you can enter the discussion in a number of different places. You can enter in terms of biblical exegesis. You could enter in the development in history. I like to begin with the pacifist. I like to begin with the Schleitheim Confession. And in the Schleitheim, it's a 16th century document, and I know people don't like history and stuff, but it's the consolidation. It's the consolidation of Anabaptist theology. Okay, and so I really want people to understand what these theologians and church people were rejecting, right, and what they were advocating. And I've got the relevant piece of the Schleitheim Confession here, but let me just summarize it. The sword, they said, of course, the metaphor of the sword in Romans 13, is ordained outside the perfection of Christ. It's a very important theological phrase, outside the perfection of Christ. It's outside the perfection of Christ because the only discipline available to the Christian church is the ban, excommunication, et cetera, et cetera. And then they ask, it will be asked concerning the sword, shall one be a magistrate if one is chosen as such? And basically the answer is no. But you can't, in other words, you can't be the magistrate that bears the sword. But then they take it a step further. Can you serve in any political office? Now, they had enough integrity to understand that any political office with any authority requires bearing the sword, right? To punish evil and to do good. Romans 13 was too clear for that. Yeah. In fact, in the area where they said, and this is the 6th article, I'm going to read this, so I apologize for it. I want to read exactly what they said. The sword is ordained of God outside the perfection of Christ. It punishes and puts to death the wicked and guards and protects the good. In the law, the sword was ordained for the punishment of the wicked and for their death, and the same sword is now ordained to be used by worldly magistrates. I usually pause right there, like when I'm at one of these academic conferences, and I say something like, "Well, they don't make Mennonites like they used to." Right, and then
right, okay.
The pacifist gets really upset. Yes. But then they say how. So then they say, In the perfection of Christ, however, only the ban is used for a warning and for the excommunication of the one who has sinned without putting the flesh to death. So what we're dealing with here is a radical dualism, right? Flesh. So it's like the government and the state is flesh. The body of Christ is spirit,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's radical dualism, right?
Nary shall the two meet, right?
Yeah. So this is classical pacifism. The important thing is to understand is they understood that in order to be consistently with this position, they couldn't just say we're not going to bear the sword by being a police officer, like a local magistrate who bears a sword, or a soldier, but we can't do politics.
Politics.
They prescind from those worldly areas, right, to live their lives, without getting involved in that kind of thing. And so we still see similar echoes of this in in Amish communities or
Amish community, right.
But
there, at the same time, there's an allowance there of the worldly magistrate to do what the worldly magistrate does vis-a-vis the world, right, which is bear the sword. There's not a challenge, an ongoing challenge by the spiritual body of Christ to say, stop, you can't do this, and so on and so forth.
That's the first point. The second point, and this will begin to get into just war theory, is understanding why that was rejected in an ecumenical fashion. All the magisterial reformers rejected that. Roman Catholics rejected that. So when you hear people like Stanley Hauerwas ranting on about Constantinianism, what he's saying is all the reformers and that are reject that because they're too worldly or whatever. But and I've written particularly try to I'm not the only one, but if you understand why Calvin, for instance, rejected it because he thought it was crazy. I mean, he said they're saying that what God is requiring of the civil magistrate, that you tell me Christians can't hold the office that God has established to do good and punish evil. He thought that was really strange. Well, anyway, I don't want to go into at length.
It's handing the world over to the world, right? It's handing governance of literally handing the governance of the world over to the wicked.
Yeah, and he thought
in some way.
Yeah, and Calvin thought that it really bizarre that Scripture holds a righteous magistrate like way up here, and he found it odd that Christians couldn't fulfill that office, but they can fill other offices like bakers and candlestick makers and all this. So and in the polemics of the day, he said things like like what kind of a knucklehead, things like that. Some of the translations, but I'll just say incidentally about that is that's why in all the creeds and confessions, the Reformed confessions, the Baptist confessions out of England, Westminster Confession, they all have something. I'll paraphrase it that says it is lawful. It is lawful for Christians to serve as magistrates and as soldiers. Like Luther writes his famous tract, whether soldiers too can be saved. So it finds its way into the confessions. Now, what's that tell you? It tells you outside of the peace churches, Christians believe they could. And then the question is, well, what are they embracing? And my argument is they know very well, right, what Augustine taught. They know what Aquinas taught. And it wasn't just appealing to them as history, but they were appealing to their interpretation of the scriptures, right? And their exegetical. Right? So pacifist attempts to say that the belief that Christians may serve as civil magistrates and it's kings and as lesser authorities, wasn't just appeal to simply history. And evangelicals need to get this, right?
Yeah.
But because these people exegeted the scriptures, and they made an argument for why Christians could serve in those capacities, including war. Now, one more thing here is that oftentimes in the tradition, and you see this in Calvin and other people, and Aquinas too, that when it comes to bearing the sword, they actually make an a fortiori argument. If it is just for a civil magistrate to punish private criminals who are robbing or theft or murdering or whatever, against an individual citizen, so they're bearing the sword justly to do justice, they say, how much more just and righteous is it for the soldier to defend the entire commonwealth, right? The entire good of the commonwealth and all the political goods of the kingdom, justice, order, peace, that kind of thing, against outward aggressors. Right.
Yeah,
so
aggressor. Right. Yeah. Okay. So, you articulated the classical pacifism as found in the Schleitheim Confessions,
Schleitheim articles.
Okay. Non-involvement. It wouldn't be it's just not non-involvement in war. It's non-involvement in politics at all. It's really a removal, right? Here's the political world. Here's the spiritual world. Christians have to stay in the one realm and cannot really engage with in the other, right? But that classical pacifism would also not be trying to intervene then constantly in the affairs of the civil magistrates and telling them what to do and what not to do. And so it would allow the magistrate to do what the magistrate does, which is at times bear the sword of punishment. And then what's being retrieved then is a just war theory that obviously goes back to Augustine and Aquinas, but you're making the point, obviously, where are they developing the just war theory? This is where evangelicals need to understand that our church fathers and medieval theologians are not just making this stuff up. They're not just philosophers, but of course that the just war theory is being drawn from the scriptures themselves. It's being drawn and developed from the scriptures themselves. Okay. So, okay. Is that good? Tim, do you want to, is there something you'd like to add?
I'll add one thing on pacifism, and that is when you move forward to contemporary pacifism, particularly in American evangelicalism today, what you're seeing is something that's very different from the classical pacifism that Keith just outlined. In that, I mean, because the Schleitheim articles that Keith reads, like, they recognize the political good of the state and the good of political order. That's just of the flesh and of the spirit, which is which, as Keith says, radical dualism. But when you keep working with that logic, you keep working forward, the pacifism that you see gain articulated and discussed by Christian scholars, activists today, is actually an anti-state pacifism. The pacifism, the state and its lawful use of the sword is now constituted as a moral evil. That is radically different.
Yeah.
Radically different. And because it's constituted as a moral evil, that places upon Christians the duty to, especially of the activist bent, the duty to resist that moral evil. And so you see an engagement in opposition to the political order, in a way that I would say is pretty hypocritical, honestly. And this is where I could appreciate the traditional Anabaptist position, that even if I disagree with the theological positioning of it, like Keith said, they at least are consistent and recognize that they can't participate. The hypocrisy of the current, more contemporary pacifism that sees the state and the political order as essentially ontologically violent and therefore a moral evil, is that it draws in a engagement with it that I think that kind of gives the ball game away a little bit, recognizing that they have to get entangled with the political world, but then that brings up all the internal contradictions of the position. Yeah. But that's another conversation. Well, actually, I just wanted to tag that.
It may be worth a minute to
go ahead.
Trace the genealogy of this.
Okay, let's do that. Let's do that.
And this is the tangled mess you get from not so much Yoder. Actually, listen, I have no truck with Yoder, but a lot of the more popular pacifist movements, like Jim Wallace, and the other side people, and a whole host of the evangelical left, that that they started out, and it was very much that America is the new Babylon. America is the beast, the whore of Babylon, and they mean it, right? It wasn't sophisticated enough to think that through, whether are all modern states uniquely evil, but they were sure. And if you go back and look at Sojourner's magazine, look at the Other Side magazine, that is the rhetoric that comes, and you get that all the way up to like Shane Claiborne guy today. I know. We look at it and we say the guy.
I've left a few messages on his Twitter feed in recent years.
But and in fact, a careful reading of that chapter on violence in Richard Hayes, this thing, you get the same thing. Like, America is the beast. We can't, whatever thought we might have opening there may be to service, no, you can't. And you get it with Stanley Hauerwas. It's like. Although Stanley isn't, but Stanley, on one hand he'll go around and says we should not be giving advice to Caesar, and then they won't shut up. All they end up doing is giving advice to Caesar. It's like, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. So, trying to untangle honest pacifists. I mean, I don't want to paint all these pacifists with that, but you would be blind if you did not see, the blame America first ideology of a lot of them. And quite frankly, I mean, if you really want to get me going, I think a lot of it has to do with, certain ideological 20th century anti-American movements. Let's just leave it
sure. Okay. So one thing would be, whereas the classical Schleitheimers, they're being more consistent in removing themselves from the political realm, and then also not being the ones that are sitting back and then offering all their advice to what the political realm then should do, even though we're not going to participate in it. So there seems to be sort of I think, Tim, you said a hypocrisy there of like, where it would look more consistent if you had a more classical pacifistic confession, you would be out in, central Indiana or somewhere in your Amish community and sort of living that more consistent pacifistic lifestyle.
And to give them their due, probably doing more good if that's what you did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then, but Tim, you also mentioned this idea of then it's not just not the non-involvement in the political realm. It's now interpreting the political magistrate as an evil, not as a good.
Mm-hmm.
And its capacity to bear the sword, not as a good, but as a moral evil, right? Something that in a sense then has to be resisted.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
And undermined, right? So,
yeah.
But then Keith, you pointed out they're not clear enough or consistent. So is that with regards to all magistrates globally, or does it just become a sort of anti-American magistrate? And I think there's a book that I read by a friend of mine, Carl Teichgrib, called Game of Gods, where it's part of the book is, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, all of these usually Protestant pastors, church leaders, so on and so forth, sometimes Catholic, just sort of not just being favorable to communism and having communist sympathies, but actually like going to communist countries or inviting sort of like communist leaders, knowing the human atrocities, knowing what has occurred in the Ukraine under Soviet rule, knowing all that, but still sort of like promoting the Soviet Union and the communist, not just the ideal, but the actual concrete communist regime.
Yeah, it plays into the contemporary sense, because, well, let me just tell you that as I was looking at this, and I realized that there was a lot of sort of leftist, sort of neo-Marxist, influence here, and I thought that looking at it narrowly, I thought, well, after the collapse of communism, right? This kind of stuff would go away, because now the increasing threat was a right, I'm going to use this term guardedly, but a right-wing theocratic Islamo-fascist regime. You would figure, wow, it's like, how can these lefties influenced by Maoist counterinsurgency tactics and Marxist, and the answer is that now it's translated more precisely into the colonial settler business. So America is not just the beast, it's the super beast. It's the super whore of Babel. It's because we are the modern colonialist power that is oppressive. So
right,
we're
expanding empire.
So what we're really saying is that to the extent that the pacifists, those who are inclined to pacifism, want to get involved in politics, unlike the peace churches, what do they pick up? They pick up a political view, whether by osmosis or whether they consciously think about this or whatever, that remarkably mirrors what I've called in the past, like the blame America first ideology. It is neither classical pacifist, and it certainly rejects a just, or it doesn't do justice to the just war tradition. And so
there's another. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, finish your.
No, I think I've got the broad point across.
I'm sorry. This is sparking off all kinds of things in my brain, because there was another book that I read called by Paul Hollander. It was called Political Pilgrims. It's 4th edition book. It's an excellent book where he talks about the cult of the victim mindset, where the victim, it's this very simplistic kind of framework. And you could see how Christians would sort of follow this. Whoever has more economic, material, military power, by default, is the immoral agent. That's it. That's your calculation. You have a greater amount of material or economic and material power. You must be the morally culpable entity in any equation, in any national or international interaction. Right. That's it. And we're not going to analyze much further beyond that. So if Israel has more military economic power, that success makes them guilty in any interaction they might have. If the United States has more power, that success makes them guilty, makes the United States guilty. I mean, it almost like, I mean, he gives multiple examples of this in that book. Political Pilgrims, I think is the name of the book, but and that kind of mindset. Maybe it was that book that I was reading too, where he talks about all these examples of Christian pastors in the sense, like Jim Wallace. I think he might even mention Wallace in there, as entertaining and sort of like, anyways, supporting the communist, not just the communist agenda, but actual leaders in the communist movement.
Well, Jim Wallace is famously said he wept for joy when when South Vietnam was overthrown by the North Vietnamese communists.
Yeah, well, exactly that type of exactly. All right, now this is good. We go down some rabbit trails. Let's get back to just war theory then. Okay, what we want is the church to start thinking in more clear and biblical and theologically robust ways about just war theory. So let's lay out maybe at this point the basic tenets of a classical just war theory. Okay. Yeah.
When I first started working on this stuff, we were invited to think about just war theory in terms of a checklist. I think that is very problematic, but it's not entirely false, because you have to kind of understand that it's more than that. It's inviting us to think morally about statecraft and the use of force. But the classic statement, and you find this in, it's actually summarized quite well in Aquinas, right? That when you're considering going to war, you have to have a just cause with right authority and right intention. Okay, these, the great just war scholar James Turner Johnson called the deontological criteria of the just war tradition. Okay, so just cause, right authority, right intention. In a second, I'll describe what those classically meant. But then, as the tradition developed, some other what would appropriately be called prudential criteria were added. That's proportionality of ends, last resort, reasonable hope of success, and the aim of peace. So, in the questions you put out, you asked, like, what are more important? I don't know if important is the right word, but classically, the ontological criteria of just cause, right authority, and right intention are the strict moral questions you have to ask. Mm-hmm. And, every once in a while, somebody writes something and a light bulb goes on. Well, it was back in the 90s when James Turner Johnson pointed out in a piece how the just cause, right authority, and right intention are pegged, right, to the political goods of justice, order, and peace. Justice, order, and peace that are to be secured by the political community. And it's not insignificant that when Aquinas asked this question, I think Augustine too, but Aquinas, what's he start with? What's the first criteria? Right authority.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I started studying this in the 80s and 90s, right authority was the Rodney Dangerfield criterion. It's like, it's right authority, right? It's like, yeah, of course. You know, it was like nobody paid attention. Everybody wanted to jump to just cause and right intention. What is right authority? Classically, it meant reservation. And I'm reading this from some notes because I want to get it exactly straight. At one time, I had all this memorized. Reservation of the right to employ force to persons or communities with no political superior. Sovereign political entities. Now, that could reside in a king. It could reside in a king and an aristocracy of nobles, or whatever the internal constitution is. There's no higher authority, right? And what that means is it's that authority that controls chain of command and has the right to exercise and maneuver forces, call an end to the use of force. That's all it means. Now, but that point is a great advance in the history of Christian thought. Why? Because what it does, it takes away from lesser authorities the right to wage private war, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's saying, so it's a unmistakable advance in Christian political thought. You couldn't do private war for private ends. You were taking the sword away from people that and it was eventually the kind of thing that it was not, that wasn't bellum, that was duellum, right? That was like kind of like duel.
Well, it's like we might think of like just classically, it's the blood feud, kind of.
Exactly.
Right? Basically, you hurt me, I hurt you. Your family hurts me, my family hurts you.
Exactly. It's what that level of
pagan tribalism, real tribalism.
Right. It was an assault. Yeah. Now it takes centuries to work this out. And that's part of neat about studying just war tradition is that you say this, but it takes time to work out, to explain to people why, you were in Afghanistan. You want to see what a tribal society is? It's like where everything's up for barter.
Well, we would call vigilantism today, right? I mean,
exactly.
It would eliminate, or it's supposed to eliminate vigilantism.
Yes. Yeah. Lesser authorities, it was taking the sword away from them. Okay, so that's right authority. So that's the good of order, the political good of order, right? So just cause. The classic statement is, now this is retaking persons, property, or other values wrongly taken when punishment of evil, right? That there was both a forward-looking and a rearward-looking aspect of traditional understanding of just cause. Retribution. There was a retributive aspect, right? And there was, so you could fight for defense. That's a just cause. You could retake something wrong. You could retake something wrongfully taken, right? And you could punish evil. Okay. As the tradition developed, this is like several hundred years of history. Gradually, the notion that a just cause could be retributive or could be retributive began to take a back seat. So in the early modern era, I see Tim shaking his head. We know what's coming. During the wars of religion, right? It was like, the Calvinists would look over the Catholic kingdom and they watch the Catholics kicking the hell. I'm sorry, beating up on Protestants. So the king would think it would be, the prince would say, I've got to go rescue, the Protestants. Well, that went on for the wars of religion. That finally, what became hardened was the only just cause could be like defense. Okay, that's an overly simplistic, but you get the idea. So the classic, notions tended to, as well as the retributive notion. So we got a narrowing of what constitutes just cause. Now, let me just say that this thing opened up in the 90s, right? And it began to take a second look at it because people were making non-defense arguments for military intervention, like humanitarian interventions. So it's like we're back to the future, right? Well, you can't let Milosevic and his people, slaughter them, and it's, in most cases, it's really stretching matters to say that you're intervening for self-defense. Who cares if a bunch of Muslims get killed? It's like, so not just in just war thinkers, but in realists who said, we're not, begin to rethink these questions, but I'm not sure they ever really were able to work it in, or they struggle in some way to claim it's really self-defense or whatever. And Tim may have something to do with that, say to that. But and finally, right intention. Now, right intention has both a positive, right, and a negative aspect. Remember when I said one of the prudential calculations, like aim of peace? I think the aim of peace is included in right intention. So what is to be avoided? Evils were, and you get this right out of Augustine, right? It's like implacable hatred, lust for vengeance, bloodlust, just aggression. So Augustine goes right to that. Vengeance,
greed.
Yeah. And then the positive aspect of what is the intention? The intention is to secure a peace. But the peace you're trying to secure is not an eschatological peace. It's not the new heavens and the new earth. It's a limited peace, and we can the IR people can translate it in to stability, regional stability, et cetera. So what you're trying to achieve, and I always make a point of really stressing this to Christian audiences and otherwise, because I think one of the great mistakes is among pacifists or otherwise is they're trying to immanentize the eschaton, right? And we're trying to bring an earthly peace, right? Augustine, it's translated a tranquility of order, right? Without the sense that we're bringing in the new heavens and the new earth. In fact, the minute anybody begins to talk about that eschatological peace, and this includes pacifists, strangely enough, and militaristic, ideological militarism of either the Maoist type or, which is really bad. But that's not what the minute you find somebody sort of like talking like that, then you've got some real problems. But that's not the just war tradition. And the minute people in the just war tradition start to talk like that too, there's another view of war you could call holy war, right? That you start to bleed over into holy war, that you're going to usher in.
Well, it seems that would certainly be the case on the side of the Islamic jihadist, right? I mean, would be the counterpoint to a just war theory would be something like a global Islamic jihad, which has every intent on.
there was one. I know Jim Johnson and some other people have written on the comparative studies of. Yeah. There are some Islamic, more limited, analogous to just war ideas out there, and I'm not enough of an authority. But people I respect say there are. But they're not in control in Iran.
Well, yeah, and we'll get to that. I mean, and maybe they're more out of the medieval sort of Muslim world, which was coupled with Aristotelianism and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But I think, I read enough even as a lowly intel sergeant with the 80s of the works of Maulana Maududi or Sayyid Qutb and Hassan al-Banna, the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah.
To think that is not the way they're conceiving of jihad.
It's not the Muslim Brothers. It's not Hamas, which is a Muslim brother. Now, I think before, I mean, this is a point that's important. So I talked about the deontological criteria and then the prudential criteria. Two things to say about that is they can't be inverted, right? And one of the problems we see is that, and this is the problem with treating it as a checklist in which all these are the same. And then somebody comes in and says, "Oh, last resort." I mean, we didn't reach a last resort. George Bush could. I mean, Trump could have got on an airplane, gone on his knees, begged the Ayatollah, to please reconsider your views of nuclear weapons. You can always last resort is not an excuse for stupidity.
It's a vague criteria.
It's the least helpful.
Keith, tell us for the so just say again the three deontological ones, and then list off the second. I don't want to call them secondary, but the prudential.
Sure. So the deontological,
and then
is right authority, just cause, and right intention. Right. Okay.
And with just cause, there was a period after around the wars of religion where it started to get reduced down to just defense of the borders, defense of the nation.
Yes.
But then more recently, just cause is starting to get.
It's all a lot more complicated than that. But the idea, I mean, Paul Ramsey in the 1960s criticized the notion of just war that was an aggressor-defender, exclusively aggressor-defender, without considerations of understanding statecraft. In other words, without understanding of the nature of the regimes we're dealing with.
Right, you can't just think of like, here's the barbarian horde in front of our gates. We can't think so simplistically about what defense means.
Right. And okay, so those are the three that Christians need to that Christians do have a responsibility to say, Christians in the military, Christians, pastors and stuff need to have some sense of asking those questions. Now, the other criteria, proportionality of ends, the overall good achieved by force needs to be greater than the bad things that happen always in war. So I mentioned last resort, reasonable hope of success. Okay, so my point, and the end of peace, which I bring up into right intention, but those prudential calculus, and this is my point, is who is in the best position to make those judgments?
John Howard Yoder.
Let's just assume you're not a pacifist, but it's generally, and this is my point, it's generally not bishops and pastors in their churches. And it's like, one of my big pet peeves is people who don't know, and I mentioned this in the article, 25 years ago is people who know nothing about military strategy, geopolitics, force structure, warfighting strategies. I mean,
enemy tactics.
They know nothing about this stuff, weighing in on the likelihood of success. Yeah. I would sit there, and, it's like a pretty high level, and I'd read this stuff. I says, these people don't know what they're talking. I come home, and it's like, working long hours, turn on TV, and you say, these guys don't know what they're talking about, right? And so I'm not saying, well, what I'm saying now is, after I've been, away from it for a while, I have, better than most people, an understanding of what's going on. But the technology for the Iran operation is so exponentially advanced in terms of cyber, drone, 15 years ago, drones and all this stuff. So who other than the legitimate authorities that are responsible or better positioned to make a judgment? Does that mean that they're always going to be right? No. I was there I was part of the non-planning for phase 4 of Iraq when everything went south. They don't always get things right. We don't. And I understand. That's the issue. But
if I can jump in here, Keith.
Yeah.
But it's acknowledging that people on the ground with the closest set of information can still get things wrong. Rather, I think particularly for Christian observers, that should enjoin a certain degree of intellectual humility rather than a cynicism of reactionary critique. And I think that's something that I think that's something that Christians in general just have to reject out of hand. There's a difference between a blind acceptance of, well, we got to trust the guys on the ground to get it right. I'm sure they'll be fine. You don't, there's that naivety that you want to reject, but you don't want to swing all the way to the other side and say, well, they always get it wrong. They're going to screw it up. So because that carries with it a certain pride, how do I want to phrase this? That gives the cynic the right to be on equal grounds with the person who's closer to the situation in the know. And so that's what equalizes that field. And we see that all over social media. Yeah. This might be getting a little ahead of the conversation, but especially when you're looking at how people are talking about and engaging with the Iran operation currently, you see that everywhere. And that's problematic.
Yeah, I always ask, do you think there are not faithful Christians in those targeting cells? It's like, do you think there are not good Christians that are thinking this through at Central Command or flying the aircraft in harm's way? It's like, you treat them, I'm not saying you have to come to a conclusion, but you're right. It's the way you engage with that sort of lack of humility. That. But see, this goes back to what we said earlier. It's like if the stance you take is, well, you shouldn't be flying aircraft. You shouldn't be. You shouldn't be pulling the trigger. You shouldn't be sitting up there at Cyber Command, turning off their. Yeah. It's like, because you're in the heart of the beast.
Yeah, right. Yeah. If you've already presupposed for other reasons that America and all of its parts are the great Satan, then, which of course is just siding with Iran and other actors like Iran. Well, but if that's your presupposition, then it's not even then really about who has the right kind of information. Yeah. It's just I don't want to coat everybody that there are men and women of goodwill. Yes.
That can say, listen, from what I know, this is going to go sideways, right? I've been around enough to see things go sideways, right? To understand what's up. but it really helps to know that this person knows what they're talking about and they're not shooting from the faculty lounge hip, you know. So
and that's the basic posture there is rejecting what I've referred to in my own writing as the rhetoric of certainty.
Yeah.
Like just reject certainty in your rhetoric, in your writing, in your speaking, in your conversation, knowing that like that's a simple way in which you can cultivate intellectual humility in your engagement with this.
Yeah.
Right. Like just reject certainty in the rhetoric.
That's super important. That's super good to think about. I mean, the other thing that, and what I wrote a series of reflections on my time in Afghanistan. It's up on my blog at Patheos. But on one of those, and I was just asking the question, like, was it worth it? Was it worth it for America? Was it worth it for the Afghans? Was it worth it for the individual soldier? And I gave different sort of answers to each. But one of the other things I worry about, though, is what I might call like the culture not having the threshold, the sort of the wherewithal anymore to deal with sort of like necessary consequences of war. Mm-hmm. Right now, we've lost, I think, 7 service members at this point. Now, in the context of a war, I don't want to treat people as numbers.
I see where you're going with this, but I feel that
too. To put it just bluntly, it's an acceptable amount of loss. And I would say that when I was in the military, at least, most soldiers would say that, right? I mean, we were trained to put the mission first, and everybody still, even those days, knew why they were there. And you're a rifleman first, even in the Army, if not, not just the Marines. But, it's like one wonders whether or not we have sort of it's almost an emotional calculus. Do we have the emotional threshold to deal with the casualties of war?
Well, and I would say this is where Keith's distinction between deontological criteria and prudential criteria is super helpful for Christians, because I think if we were giving guidance to pastors to helping their congregations think through this, it's like you really need to make sure that you have the moral clarity to speak on the deontological things, because that's actually, thanks to the scriptures, that's actually something 100% of Christians have access to. You can access that discussion.
Right.
Then at the prudential, and I would even argue the ability to see the deontological components clearly is going to equip you. It's going to lay the foundation to right size the prudential components. That's what makes that distinction both helpful, but also critical and necessary to maintain. Like gain the deontological right gives you that entryway, and I think starts building the intellectual resources to then navigate the emotional ups and downs of navigating a conflict.
That's right.
Hey, I printed out. This is related to what we're saying, but it goes back to something. I wanted to read something from Michael Walzer, and I think I probably should do a quick explanation of who Michael Walzer is. Michael Walzer wrote the standard book in the 1976. It was published, called Just and Unjust Wars, using all the war colleges, using PME widely, et cetera. Now Walzer, I've got some. The book is called Just and Unjust Wars, and Walzer is a rights theorist. He wasn't Christian. He's Jewish. In fact, he's a democratic socialist. Writes for Dissent magazine, and so he's a certified lefty. But he was trying to recover the just war tradition, and he has, that book is great for case studies. By the way, we've got a lot. Some of us have some quibbles with them, but as I was saying, we were fighting the fight in the 80s, throughout the 90s, about this attempt to hijack the just war tradition by those who are bringing to it pacifist assumptions. And one of the things they do theoretically is they flip the they flip the criteria and focus on the prudential calculus because it's easier to do. The other thing they would do in the 90s the argument went like this, that modern war is unique such that it is inherently discriminatory, inherently disproportional, therefore no war can be met that would meet the jus in bello, like how to fight the war. Therefore, modern war is unjust. All modern war is unjust. So that's another aspect of, so these people were not pacifists, but this is another way that they would say. Now,
but it backs them into the pacifist corner.
It does. And so,
because then, in practically speaking, there will never be a war that you could actually engage in.
Bingo. That's right. And so, in response to that, the best response to that was by Jim Johnson and George Weigel, who wrote this book called Can Modern War Be Just? Well, it just so happens that these people are coming around with the claim that modern war is inherently indiscriminate right at the time you're getting precision weapons, right? And so that kind of just falls apart. No, we can still strike. Yeah, we can fight justly. We train our So that's another strain in that to these people that say, "Oh yeah, I'm a just war guy, but no modern war can be just," right? The other way is just sort of like creepy colonialist, settler resistor ideology. Okay, so I can't tell you how I was overjoyed when I read this little thing in Parameters, which is Parameters was the Army War College's journal.
Okay.
So here's what he said.
Is this Walzer?
This is Walzer. So I need to read this because I got this left-wing democratic socialist saying precisely what we Christian just warriors were saying. Let's get to the crux of the matter. For many clerics, journalists, and professors, however, have invented a wholly different interpretation and use, making the just war theory more and more stringent, particularly with regard to civilian deaths. In fact, they have reinterpreted it to a point where it is pretty much impossible to find a war conflict that can be justified. Historically, just war theory was meant to be an alternative to Christian pacifism. Actually, I think Christian pacifism wasn't. But anyway, but you get the point. Now, for some of its advocates, it is pacifism's functional equivalent, a kind of cover for people who are not prepared to admit that there are no wars they will support. This is Michael Walzer. This isn't, right-wing extremist, this is, I used, in a lecture, I read this, I say, it's like, he's a democratic socialist. I says, Michael Walzer is, it's like Bernie Sanders with brains. So Walzer, who I think has, and I think he's done some modifications to the just war tradition that are not helpful, and I've sort of crossed swords with him. But on the big picture, he saw that he's Jewish, right? And he was seeing what was happening, what the kind of arguments that people were throwing forth, then this was,
70s.
No, he wrote this in 2008.
Right, but after seeing this development of this kind of front loading the prudential criteria in such a way that there just never is going to be particularly. Well, actually, he's getting at it at the point that I just made, that we didn't discuss much about the jus in bello, which is the principles by which one is non-combatant immunity from attack, or the principle of discrimination, and the other one is proportionality of ends, right? So the argument being made by non-pacifists, right, was that you can't fight justly, therefore no war can be just, therefore you should never go to war. Right. So that's functional pacifism. Conditions will never obtain in modern warfare that
right.
could
Even
be,
if you ran the use ad bellum criteria and you checked them all off, well, you can't go. You can't fight, right? So that yeah. So and people like Weigel and Johnson, and then some of us younger guys at the time, put our oars in the water and started pushing back. So you see how the theologians, like the Catholic theologians who wrote the peace pastoral back in the 1980s, and how all the Christian left pacifists of the Jim Wallace and the Hayes and the Hayes and Hauerwas were the intellectual that brought this forward, dovetails into this, right? And so they come to the table saying, "Oh, we're just war too, and you bad guys, me, and people like Mark Levesque and James Turner Johnson are the bad guys because we don't, we're appealing to the older classical tradition, which they consider to be too bellicose, right?"
So, and on this point of you can't, because it's impossible to fight a modern war justly, no modern war can be just. If listeners somehow think this is just all insider baseball and a discussion between theologians and academics, it's worth pointing out that this discussion actually made its way into pop culture in the 1990s fairly explicitly. So if listeners are familiar with the film Crimson Tide, which, by the way, I love. It's a great film that explores chain of command, ethics in war. Stars Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman. There's a conversation between Gene Hackman's commander of a nuclear missile submarine and his first mate, executive officer Denzel Washington, where they're talking about under what conditions, under what conditions would we launch a nuclear weapon off of this sub? And again, this movie's in the 1990s, so we're past the Cold War. And Denzel Washington has this line in the movie where he says, "In my opinion, in a nuclear world, the real enemy can't be defeated." And they're like, "Oh, who's the real enemy?" And he just said, "The real enemy is war itself."
Mm-hmm.
And that, like in a way that only a well-written Hollywood script can do, that encapsulates that basic position and debate that Keith just outlined.
There is no situation that is worse than war itself.
War is the worst thing.
And it's not even, and critically, it's not because Denzel Washington's character is not saying a nuclear war is the worst war to happen or it's the only unjust war. He's saying because nuclear weapons exist, any war is unjust, and which, when you stop and think about it by itself, that's a really, on its face, it's a really strange argument. That's a certain non sequitur to that, but it just encapsulates that basic idea.
Well, look, I'll tell just real quick personal story, and then we are gonna shift this all onto Iran now, and we're gonna start asking about the current conflict. And but I mean, it does. I mean, I think it affects the military itself to some degree. I mean, I remember my second or third week in Afghanistan, and we were in the sticks. We were out, in Ghazni province, in a small district of Ghazni province closer to Pakistan, in kind of the middle of nowhere. And I remember one of the E7s who was admin. He had come to our COP. We only had aerial infill and exfil because the roads were just littered with IEDs. So, just to do some admin work. And he's a good guy. He's a Christian man. And we got to talking a little bit. And I remember him saying, it was like me, the chaplain, who had also flown in from the neighboring district. And he's like, he just had, like, in this moment of sort of moral clarity or moral questioning, I guess, more. He's like, he's just like standing there in the talk, in our CP. And he's like, I'm a Christian. I'm really starting to wonder if we should be here. And and it was, and we had a small conversation about it, and maybe I made a few points. I don't know. I was a new Christian. I had just gotten saved like a year and a half before, but it struck me later. I'm like, wow, it's really kind of a question you want to ask long before you wind up in country somewhere. You want to have thought about that a little bit more before then all of a sudden you're, 300 meters from a Taliban outpost, and you're asking yourself whether or not you're here for just cause or not, or that your military is, or that your government is. So anyways, we want to bring this to Iran now, in particular, because this is happening again, right? I think the U.S. bishops just issued a statement. I know a couple did. I was listening to Hugh Hewitt on the radio last night.
Oh, you don't have to cite the bishops. The Pope has been like hitting every talk show and social media outlet he can.
I've done a lot with some Catholic theologians on when we talked about Pope Francis. So Leo, almost from my hometown. I've driven through his hometown a couple times. Following in Francis's footsteps, I would say for sure. The U.S. bishops, I think Hewitt mentioned. I know he mentioned Cardinal Cupich in Chicago.
Yeah, I read it.
And probably a handful of others doing it again. So whether it's the 80s or 90s, now we have the same phenomenon, I think, happening again in light of Iran. So let's get to Iran, and I'll just put it out there simply. Why Iran and why now? From a just war perspective.
Well, certainly, I'm going to actually do what we've just been critiquing. Let's put the prudential criteria first. If we're going to get nitpicky about things like last resort, it's really hard to make the argument that there's still more that could be done when this war has been 40 plus years in the making. So I'll just frame that up, and just to give, and the reason I do that is I want people to understand where I'm coming from. Is I'm looking at the history of America's relationship with the Iranian regime, and basically what you have from 1979 to now is an unremitting campaign of asymmetric warfare between Iran and America, promulgated by the Iranian regime, grounded in a well, you mentioned earlier, Keith, the problem of trying to make the eschaton imminent. That's exactly the theological framework the Ayatollahs are working out of. They are making the eschaton imminent, and so to that end, the destruction of America and Israel is necessary. So there can be no real political peace between a regime that has that perspective of your regime. So that's the backdrop to this. The biggest frustration I've had over the last 2 weeks has been that piece just being completely ignored. That the current conflict is being looked at entirely in a vacuum of not even the first Trump administration. Even if you wanted to go back to the first Trump administration and look at the attack that killed Qasem Soleimani, you find there the seeds for a just cause. Because no one disputed the fact that Soleimani, a commanding general in the IRGC, was in Iraq to do operational planning for killing Americans. Like, the fact of the matter is and the reason I'm starting with the prudential stuff is because I think even the critics of this conflict actually know that they can't argue the deontological criteria. When we talk about just cause, legitimate authority, right intention, those things I think are pretty settled on this conflict. The entity that is promulgating the conflict is the American military. Now, we can talk about the legal authorities of the president and everything in there, but even the way I described it to my students at Biola is the moral and ethical, like the just cause component, That's clear. If you want to talk about legitimate authority and the legal authority of the president, there's at least a reasonable legal basis. There can be arguments and quibbles, but there's a reasonable legal basis. At which point you have to start talking about right intention. What's the end game here? And this is where you've seen a lot of public debate, or the attempts at public debate, to say like, well, what's the objective? What's the Trump administration doing? They're not really clear about this. I would argue, and I'm hopeful this piece will go live soon for Providence, an article I just wrote for them. I argue that actually the Trump administration has been pretty darn clear about what the intention is. The intention is that you can't have a nuclear Iran. You can't have an Iran that threatens the region and Israel with their ballistic missiles, and you can't have an Iran promulgating in regional stability with proxy terrorist groups. And so far, that's what we're targeting. So I think it's pretty clear. It seems like the deontological criteria have all been nailed and are checked off, to use the checklist, which means the debate functions at the prudential level here primarily. But Keith, I'll let you weigh in.
Yeah, I would just reiterate what you said. I mean, I think the case can be made that we've been in a state, we, U.S., certainly Israel, our ally and us, have been in a state of bellum with the Iranian regime since 1979.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I know why there will be resistance to that, right? Because there are, throughout those 47 years, there have been intermittent attempts to deal with the problem kinetically and non-kinetically, diplomatically and economically and other ways. But if I really need to get down in the brass tacks, I'd say that we've been in a state of bellum, if not in a state of active kinetic. And so in a way, I'd say you don't even have to look at the deontological criteria. They've all, we're in a state of war.
You're already
it's
there.
been long satisfied.
We're already in a state of bellum. Now, why now? Okay. Last night and early this morning, I listened to I watched Frontline. And normally I'm very skeptical about what Frontline puts out, but they actually did a pretty good job, I must say, in sort of detailing 47 years of history with Iran and leading up to the strikes last summer. And so it was actually pretty good. A few quibbles here and there, but and it seemed to me that toward the end they got to the most salient moral question, and it had to do with whether the Israelis and the U.S. the current strike on Iran was preventive war, right? Or it was in some sense preemptive. Now those are some fine legal details, and the commentator, former defense national security advisor for Israel, said that after 10/7, the Israelis said that we're not going to play deterrence anymore. We played deterrence with Hamas. We played deterrence. The terminology is mowing the lawn, right? Mm-hmm. The strategy toward dealing with the Hamas threat was mowing the lawn, and then 10/7 happened, and it wasn't just Bibi. The entire defense establishment realized they screwed up. And because they believed that Hamas was contained, because they are now a de facto nation state and they would not risk all their power as a de facto government of Gaza, right, with what they did. And after that, the Israelis simply said, we can't afford to do this anymore. And well, in fact, you know that right after 10/7, the debate was over whether they were going to attack Hamas or whether the primary effort was going to be north against Hezbollah. And the military and other people, and I think the Mossad wanted them to go after Hezbollah, right? But there's no way Bibi said, no, there's no way I cannot go at, right? And so they said. So I bring that up to just say that there are allies, and we backed our allies, maybe not as firmly as some of us wish that we did, but we did. Even Biden administration did. And so you've got the tentacles, the 8th Front War, 7th Front War, all these de facto, basically it's all Iranian proxies. So, and that just goes back to a couple years. That's even before you get to taking Marines and diplomats hostages, 1983, Beirut, which is personal, and so you can go easily enough find online the list of all the acts that counts as act of war, and then finally, activities. The nature of the regime is terrorist, and this is
terrorist and as religious eschatological. Yeah. I mean, I never see anybody ever talk about something like what the theological motivations of the regime and the return of the Mahdi.
If you're
this is like, how is this not like? I don't know if people
they
don't want to go
in
there
on that point because
it's religious, but
but Keith just said it. It's because if your framework is classical realism, theological framework doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right. Theological motivation doesn't matter. So and that's, by the way, that's a lot of the foreign policy journalists are going to go through that framework.
I remember. Correct me if I'm wrong, Keith. But didn't Obama make some kind of claim that climate change was a force, augmented, or augmenting the ISIS's operations, because it was almost like he was trying to make a connection between climate change and the internal motivation for ISIS to conduct its terrorist operations.
Well, it's the same as making the discredited claim that it's poverty that drives people into terrorism.
It's always poverty,
right? Like it's poverty, it's climate change, and I think what you see in that, what you see in that is a grasping for an explanation. There's a recognition that there's something that motivates Islamic jihadists that the Western mind doesn't recognize. The secular Western mind just doesn't recognize. They're not historical materialists. They're not empiricists. They're being motivated by something else. But because the West has largely lost, and especially Western elites, decision makers, policymakers, academics, journalists, have largely lost the theological frame and the ability to even see it as a legitimate what's the word I'm looking for? A legitimate epistemological and decision-making framework. It's not even considered. I get pretty amped up on this because this was actually a component of my dissertation. Because one of the basic claim in my dissertation that I was trying to demonstrate is that international relations theory in America, in the American Academy in particular, is because it's so heavily quantitative based, because it's so heavily grounded in empiricism, it tends to place variables of culture, which includes theology and values, in it. That's a statistical error. That's an error term. That's just part of they literally classify that as the noise in their statistical models when they're trying to explain sources of conflict and everything. So what that does is it creates this analytical hole in which you're trying to explain motivation and decision making. Why won't the Iranians come to the table after getting pulverized? Why do they ignore their own people, mow them down by the thousands when they're protesting economic conditions and mismanagement? Why would they do that after like even getting partial sanctions relief. And the only way you can explain that is because they're true believers. They're committed to this theological framework that says these are your two major enemies. You must defeat them in order to like bring about the eschaton. And this is how they're going to go about doing it. And, you know, if their own people don't seem to get that, well, that's their problem. Maybe they deserve to die, kind of thing. I mean, that is just so foreign to how so much of the secular West thinks that it's got to be an error. It's got to be, you know, we got to be missing something. And I think what I've generally found to be the safest way to assess the Iranians is take them at their word when they talk about problems. Because the other thing that there's been a couple of really good interviews floating around on social media with Trump administration officials from the first Trump administration and this current administration who have negotiated with the Iranians, and they'll all say like, look, the Iranians just lie. They'll say whatever they want to say to get to where they want to go. And that part's true, but that's only, again, those Trump officials are also suffering from the same like lack of theological frame, because that's only half the equation. They're lying because their theological frame permits them to lie to the enemy. So when they say what their objectives are and what they will do to achieve victory, you can actually believe them telling the truth. They're not lying about that, but they will lie about what they're willing to do to cooperate and work with you. So they will lie in the negotiation table. They will not lie when they're talking about what their strategy and objectives are. And that's a helpful way of like analyzing the Iranian position.
You know, when I enlisted in the Army at the young age of 33, and before I went down to basic training in Missouri, I went for a trip to Washington, D.C. to visit a friend who had been a captain in the Army. And I remember buying 2 books and bringing those books with me and reading them under the Washington Monument. One was Sayyid Qutb's Milestones. The other was Maulana Maududi's Toward Understanding Islam. Mm-hmm. And I think I understood Islam, or at least that version of Islam, which is, and I was like, well, you know, this is the motivating factor for our contemporary conflicts. Most of them, 90% of them, maybe. And I was still astounded that, you know, now I was just, again, an enlisted guy. So I'm sure these were more familiar to the officers and stuff that was, but it was still like, no.
Keith is in there shaking his head.
But I had to have several conversations along the way in my short 5.5-year career with people about like, guys, we need to understand the theological sources here if we're really going to do intelligence analysis on like human intelligence stuff. So, but that was a hard conversation to have with people, because I mean, in part because it just seems so like foreign to even think in theological terms.
That's right. And I mean, I confronted this too. I was an intel officer, you know, and it's the same thing. And it's what runs the State Department. You know, it's why the State Department can go to Kabul and run up the gay flag at the embassy and think that we're going to bring liberal democracy to Afghanistan. Oh, don't get me going. But it's because
that would be a good psyop if you just wanted to piss some guys off and then get your iron sights on them.
But it's because religion is really not just Christianity. Any religion and theology is epiphenomenal, and whatever they say is their motivation. Their true motivation has to be anti-colonialism. It has to be
the old oppression. 19th century 2-tier theories.
Yeah,
the superstructure is this, but beneath the surface, it's material conditions.
Exactly. That's exactly, and it's like, and that's Foggy Bottom, and in the State Department for sure. And then, and the other thing is that, there's this old book by Carter, but Religion is a Hobby. It was by the Yale Law School professor, black guy. I can't. Okay, senior moment. But religion is a hobby, and he talks about how his colleagues in the Ivy League, that's how they think about religion. It's a hobby. It's interesting, like building model airplanes or whatever.
Something you do in your leisure time.
Yeah, some people go to the golf course Sunday morning. You go to church, right? But it can't, it can't
possibly influence your decision making
of anything of great weight. And then to the extent that these guys do think about, say, Christian theology, it's sort of this 19th century liberal,
It's a social psychological safety net for people that is, if it's sort of the utility, or like maybe like the William James sort of like pragmatic view. Hey, if it makes people happy, if it lends to some kind of greater happiness for more people, we can let it be, endorse it or some way. But it doesn't. It's at most something like an adaptive, to use the Darwinian term, like an adaptive phenomenon thing that the organism does, and it can sort of help out a certain way, and it provides these social benefits of fellowship and things like that.
Yeah, you're right.
Well, if I could just tie this back into the discussion about the prudential components of just war theory, this is really important, because if you're going to drop off the theological frame of the enemy as a critical component of their decision making, of what comports with their view of reality, that's going to skew your analysis on things like probability of success. It's going to skew your analysis on things like what would be an acceptable outcome. And this is where I would, as much as I'm happy to defend the position that I believe this is a just war. I believe that the Trump administration has probably picked one of the best times they can engage this conflict with Iran. I will still say, like, one of my main points of criticism of the president here is that repeatedly, and I get, like, he's an incurable optimist, but his repeated comments about, like, oh, we're proceeding ahead of schedule, like, we're going to get this war over and done fairly quickly. It's like, yeah, in a world where you're dealing with people who are viewing this as politics by other means, the way we seem to be viewing it, yeah, that might be the case. But when you're dealing with a regime who really does believe that they're God's chosen instrument for bringing about the, for implementing the eschaton, then I'm not sure you can say that unless you're willing to go much further in destroying them than you might be willing to go at the moment. And that's that should be a pretty sobering assessment. And this is why, one, I roll my eyes at the chattering class that starts saying, like, well, why aren't we, like, thinking about the off ramp? It was 12 days last year and now we're at day 12 now. Like, shouldn't we be wrapping this up? That's annoying. That's noise. Yeah. But there is an important question underneath that, which is, how long are we willing to go here? Because I'll tell you what, the Iranian regime, if you accept that they view this conflict through a certain theological frame, and that is how they engage reality, they're in it to win it. And it's an existential crisis, and for them, in a way that it is not for us. It's a strategic crisis for us, but it's an existential one for them. And that changes, and they've already been at war with us in their own mind for 40 plus years. You think they're going to just, like, roll over after just a few months of this? No way. Now, I don't think it's a forever war. I do not think it's a forever war, but it's also not going to be over this year.
Yeah.
I know I just said reject the rhetoric of certainty, and I just kind of like sounded really certain there. I don't think it's going to be over this year. So let me put that caveat on there.
Well, yeah. So to put it in terms of what we were saying earlier is I think you made a comment that pegged me to that made me think about this, that how you perceive things like last resort or reasonable chance of success is determined by your judgment of the nature of the regime. Remember when I said that, like Paul Ramsey always said that just war is in the context of statecraft. So if I believe, certain things about the regime, based on their past history, and I'm going to probably have a little more elastic understanding of what last resort is, even if we're talking about last resort for what I would say this campaign, or this kinetic campaign.
You're going to need last resorts.
Yeah. And
that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Right. Over and over.
Yeah. Because I mean, you're hearing, well, we could have, there wasn't an imminent attack. And they say, well, since it wasn't an imminent attack, it does not meet with international law. Right. But if you're sitting there saying, yeah, what you just said about this regime is not going to cry uncle, and what they've already said, they keep telling us, Israel's the little Satan, we're the big Satan. It's like, you can imagine the analysts down there in the State Department foggy body saying, that they don't mean that. That's just rhetoric. That's just rhetoric. That's what you hear. That's just rhetoric.
Yeah.
No, how about maybe they really
not
believe
just rhetoric. It's not
right.
It's crazy. I mean,
I know it's the thing. It's same with Hamas.
Not rhetoric to the suicide bomber who blows himself up in front of your EP.
Yeah,
exactly. It's like, come on.
And how many times have I had over Hamas? I've had to explain to people. Have you ever read the charter? In your IR class, you make everybody read the charter, and then point them to the footnote where they quote the protocols of the elders of Zion. Where do they get that stuff? Well, shorthand, they got it from the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who got it from the Nazis. That's where they got it, right? Yeah. And yet you read that stuff, and people, they don't believe you. I said these people make the Klan.
Well, this is the scariest thing, I think, is, and I keep remembering that. Who was that KGB agent who defected, and he gave that one interview? It's all over the line, where he talks about active operations, Bemizov or whatever. But he makes this point in that interview about the time's going to come where you'll show people the evidence. It is an abundance of evidence that this is what's being done, and they'll still just say, "No, I don't believe it." And it's kind of like that. I mean, this is the scariest thing. Like you just show the evidence of what either the regime or its proxies say over and what they do. And then, maybe they recede for a while, and then they come back with the next wave, more brutal, more maybe with more technology than the prior wave of attacks. But it's like, now it's just like, oh, we don't care. Mm-hmm. We don't care. Well, and so well, or it's like or there's no, it doesn't matter. We're not willing to sacrifice anything to fight it.
This comes back. I mean, I know one of the things we want to talk about, how terrorism. I want to say something about terrorism, because the employment of terrorism reveals the nature of the regime, or rather, the willingness to resort to nearly unrestrained terrorism tells you about the nature of the regime, which should factor in to the prudential calculus. Now, what I said in that piece I wrote 25 years ago is that terrorism is about as close to what the old moral theologians called malum in se, evil in itself. Not just simply because it violates the jus in bello criteria of non-combatant immunity or discrimination, but because it's assault on the deontological criteria to start with. It's an assault on justice, order, and peace, right? And it's why, as the just war tradition worked its way into the laws and customs of war, that you couldn't do that kind of thing. Like it's like that kind of terrorist stuff would get you shot by the authorities. And anything that come close to it, which is why guerrilla warfare during the Civil War, there were no, or spies who weren't in uniform, or guerrillas that were out terrorizing, right? Civilians, they could be rounded up and
shot on sight.
Right? Now, why was that? It was a civilian protective standard under conventional war. The longer question comes up is, throughout the 20th century, those civilian protective standards that found their way in the Geneva Conventions at the early part of the century, there's been a steady eroding of that, right? There's a steady eroding of that in the laws and customs of war and international law to make room for wars of national liberation and Maoist-inspired insurgency tactics against the colonialist powers, right? So what goes? What goes is the dress requirement, carrying arms openly, et cetera. So the civilian protective standards get lowered. And of course, as part of the Maoist insurgency strategies was always selective terror, right? You not only hostage using the population as a shield from direct attack for reasons, obvious reasons. Like they shield from attack. Plus, if the friend, the state power, goes after insurgents and they kill, they lose the population. So it's all a strategy. Well, that gets eroded, right? And as I said earlier, okay, Soviet Union collapses, but what's left? What's left is radical Islamist movements that are continuing the insurgency, but the terror is not even nearly as selective as the terror that was used in sub-Saharan Africa and even Latin America stuff. So we've gotten so used to putting up with terrorism that when you say it's a terrorist state, it kind of rolls off your tongue. It rolls out there without people saying, wait a second.
What's actually going on?
The laws of war and the just war tradition said this is not the way you fight justly, right? And we've let the cat out of the bag to the point now where we kind of shrug and say, yeah, they've been conducting terror proxy wars for 47 years, but gee, and my attitude is they've told you what they're going to do, and it's like I thought when 10/7 happened. I did a podcast with my friend for Providence, Mark Levesque, and I said, Mark, that we all know, I knew that it would be a matter of time. Maybe I thought it would be a few months before you started to get, yes, the IDF is being disproportionate and they're killing too many civilians. I mean, within a week. I mean, it was within a week.
Yeah.
They were out, claiming that the Israelis were involved in slaughtering civilians disproportionately and not being discriminated. you hear it all over the place. Oh, they're conducting obliteration bombing. Not obliteration. Absolute idiocy. And I stop and I say, okay, if we're seeing it this quick, that's organized. And sure enough, it's like, it was funded and organized. They're ripping down in Colombia. They're ripping down the posters of the hostages and those that were killed within a week. So you stop and, that's what I say. I'm not inclined to conspiracies.
But you start,
But when you look at that, you stop and you say, "Nah, this was calculated." That
this is what I've been feeling more and more, though, too. It's like it's not just ignorance plus sort of like a sort of emotional manipulation. There's intentional sort of infiltration, sort of here where you have what's the term? Fourth column, fifth column, kind of a
fifth column, like fifth column stuff.
Yeah, where like to what extent has sort of Islamic Jihad worked its way through the institutions and is organizing within the ranks of our own institutions, academic institutions.
That's what's so strange.
It's hard to. Because it seems
what's hard for us old guys is that, I tend to be more conservative, but I was trained with liberal academics, like Rawlsian liberals and those guys that you can have a rational conversation with, and I'm old enough. I was in grad school in the 80s, and I remember I had to read some critical legal studies stuff, and the liberals in the class.
Oh, I've read some of that.
So these guys, they said, these guys are freaking crazy. The critical study stuff, because they're old school liberals, and we, and now I look around, and they would think, oh, the stuff you saw at Columbia University, the old school liberals said that stuff is crazy, but it's harder to, because of the partisanship of the environment, is to find those old school liberals will look. Now they're there. I don't want to get all political, but when I think you have to distinguish between the true sort of like ideologues and the ones that are playing along. A lot, I think, Dem politicians are playing along for political advantage. It's like, they learned their lesson. I grew up in Pennsylvania. I could not believe that Kamala Harris did not pick Josh Shapiro to be her vice president. It was like, this was a no-brainer. She has to win Pennsylvania. There's no way she loses Pennsylvania with I know Pennsylvania very well. Josh Shapiro on that ticket. But you got the pressure of genocide Josh, right? And there's no way she's going to pick it. Now,
because he's calling Israel genocidal?
Because he's Jewish.
Because he's Jewish.
Okay.
He's Jewish, and he spent some time working with the IDF in his youth. It's like, and he's got to be very careful about that. So there's that going on, right? Okay. And you look, and the other thing. So there's the true believers, right? And then there's people that just look like, we cannot come out and support this operation publicly and survive in the election. And the sad thing is that, it used to be the water's edge deal, but I look at these guys coming out, and I know the way these briefings go, that they go in, they do a operational intelligence briefing to the Gang of Eight, right? So it's bipartisan, and it's like they're coming out of there and they're already saying, there's no way we can accomplish our justice. There's no way this is. And it's crap. It's all a political thing. So in a sense, I can get that because they're hacks. It's like, but trying to this, and the Republicans got the same problem, right? The Republicans have the problem because you've got the isolationist right that.
Yeah, well, I wanted to bring this up. Okay.
That Trump has been playing footsie with. America first.
Yeah.
Right? America first, no endless wars. So, and it's always been my big problem with Trump is that he's playing too footsie with the isolationist wing. And sure enough, the chickens are coming home to roost with the kooky right wing crowd.
Tucker Carlson.
The Tucker Carlson crowd.
Let's just say Tucker Carlson. I don't know, Candace Owens in some way, and I mean, I wanted to bring this up actually.
And the more ideologically inclined isolationists like Rand Paul, who I I disagree with that stuff, but so both sides of the political side are playing footsie with the extremists on the wings that they have to keep on board for electoral reasons, and that complicates. See, okay, it's like we're talking about just war theory, and we're trying to do this, and then we're trying to sort through the noise, and then of course the question. This is over to you guys. How do we communicate to Christians who either think it's all noise, right? Or they're not sophisticated enough to understand, or they're reflexively one way or the other. They're reflexively, they say, good people. It's like, why am I paying $5 now for, he runs a business for my diesel, right? Mm-hmm. He's like, I got work to do, and so the depth of their theology is not deep, but neither is the depth of their political understanding, right? And even if they're reflexively, I'm going to vote for Trump because I'm not going to vote for her, right? Right. And they're hearing, no endless wars. And see, somebody like me listened to that, and I could say I was always worried about the isolationist stuff, but I always read that is we're not going to do boots on the ground, regime installation, regime change, right? And so by that, I think Trump gets it. We're not going to put maneuver troops on the ground. We're not going to install a regime. Believe me, after I retired, I was in Afghanistan 3 years, when you were there, but up at Kabul. I was retired doing other stuff, but and I lived through like I say, the Iraq thing too. So I saw that happen. I've experienced, and it actually, all those failures came about precisely for the reasons we've been talking about, because people did not understand that we were dealing with a still hyper-tribalistic society with an overlay of various forms of Islamism. So the lesson learned from that, rightly by the Trump administration, is, we're not going to do that. We're going to do in and out. We're going to do
well. And with regards to the Islamic theaters of operations, you could almost say that the Muslim, the Muslim that is conducting operations is almost one-to-one a true believer, right? That's just, it's sort of like, that's just what it is. That's just what it was. Mm-hmm. But I'm, this thing that you pointed, we're speaking of people like Carlson and the ignorance, the ability to easily be swayed one way or other by a certain kind of social media influencer right now, either to the left or the right. We sort of expect these sort of anti-war rhetoric on the left from this sort of pacifistic modern pacifism that we've articulated here, but the sort of like isolationism.
It's
from the socially conservative right, from the socially conservative side.
And I think we have to be even more frank than that. There's more than an undercurrent of anti-Semitism going on here.
Well, yes.
I mean,
yeah.
I would. Yeah. Let me commend you guys, and there's a podcast that our friend Mark Levesque did from Providence, did with Luke Moon, and if I can find it, he is discussing just war in the context of Tucker Carlson's interview with Huckabee, U.S. ambassador. Okay. And I thought Luke and particularly Mark on Just War did a really good job. But the downside is that I had to listen to the bile and disingenuous comments coming from Tucker Carlson. And one of the things this is where it became so dishonest that Huckabee was trying to explain the measures to which the IDF was going in Gaza to mitigate civilian casualties, phone calls and leaflets and I mean, it's just, and he said they go way beyond anything the Americans did, in recent urban, and I couldn't believe it when Carlson jumped on him and started attacking Huckabee. He says, "Oh, why are you saying that? You're denigrating America. You're criticizing Americans for not preserving lives and stuff." No, the point was not that the Americans were being unlawful in, say, Mosul. We were playing, within the laws and customs of war and by the Jus and Bella and the laws of war in an urban environment. What he was saying is the Israelis are going beyond those.
Yeah.
They were performing actions, civilian protective actions that exceed the requirements of the laws of war. And when I saw that, I said, that has got to be the most disingenuous.
Yeah, totally.
Like I use the example as like,
you're being anti-American.
You can play within this is where people don't understand. Like, okay, you have the laws of war, or like the sidelines in football, right? The rules of engagement are the hash marks, right? As you know from Afghanistan, it's like we have to play within the hash marks, and there sometimes can be very good reasons for that. There sometimes can be really stupid reasons for that, right? And that's the prudential calculus that military people do, right? But to point out that, that the Israelis are playing between the hash marks, right? Even though and then say you're criticizing the Americans for just playing at the
and we didn't. Yeah, the Israelis are. Oh, you're saying we didn't play within the hash marks?
No, we did not play. We no. It's like, and that's because the argument is that, and John Spencer, who's the expert on this, points out that the Gaza operation was well within the norms for civilian casualties in a combat environment. It wasn't even with subterranean tunnels of the sort.
Tunnels.
So anyway, that's just a narrower point about the broader political situation for people who are, either they occasionally listen to a Tucker Carlson podcast or a Candace Owen, whatever stuff, or their extent of their news is like a headline or something coming over social media, and how to cut through that. Younger people need to figure that out because I'm too old for that stuff. It's like,
Tim, why don't you speak to, because this is like, to me, this is like super serious, because I almost feel like, guys, at some point you get the social media influencers are affecting people in such a way where evil will is just then further facilitated, right? I mean, it can build to real social and political resistance to things that would otherwise be just and right to do, right? So it is all connected. I mean, look, I get to the point where when I start to hear people like Tucker Carlson, and I'm like, is this somebody who's just a true believer in isolationism, or is this somebody who's been gotten to by somebody else? Like, is this somebody who's like now sort of an asset in the hands of some other?
Well, he's making a lot of money.
I mean, look, anyways, but as far as like, I don't know, like waking, even just our local congregations, waking our church up. You're teaching at, Christian university. Gosh, how to cut through this stuff and get some clarity and some reason.
Well, I think this is where it kind of comes back to the beginning of this conversation. It's just like, this is where just war theory and the Christian tradition of it can actually bring a lot of clarity. I want to draw several strands into this. And first, I want to note that just to give an idea of how the reason it feels so noisy, because it is obviously, but the reason it feels so noisy, the reason it feels like we don't know which way is up, is because of how loose commentators and influencers have gotten with language and how frequently saying one thing means something else. So Keith mentioned earlier that during the Trump campaign in 2024, one of the major pledges on foreign policy was no forever wars, no endless wars. Well, that's not what people are saying. That's not what a lot of the isolationists, libertarians are saying. They're saying Trump said no foreign wars. Huge difference between no forever or no endless war and no foreign war. Yeah. And I think my first question to such isolationists is, would you prefer a domestic one? Because that's ridiculous. But on the other hand, so first off, just to note that people are playing very fast and loose with language, and they're using unequivalent terms. And so this is where, you kind of like put your historian's hat on, say, you need to go look at the primary source documents. And so in the article I just sent to Providence yesterday, that's one of the things I do is I try to like take the deontological criteria of just war, and I try to map it onto the primary source documents that we do have from the Trump administration on Iran. And I think when you put those things together, it cuts through the noise really, really quickly. And so the reason I put this article together was to try to answer your question, Keith, is like try to put forward a model to people, like, here's how you cut through the noise. I think one of the ways you do that is you look at those deontological conditions. So you say like, so you wake up, right, like most of us did a couple of weeks ago on Saturday to find that we were at war with Iran. Most people immediately go to X, they go to Substack, and they start getting all the hot takes. Well, they've already lost the battle because at that point, like, you're already in the noise, you're already getting the hot takes, it's already overwhelming. I think the first thing you need to do is hit pause and say, okay, like, the bombs are flying. Is there a cause for this? Right? That's the just cause. Like, is there, and you look at those sub points that Keith outlined. Were we attacked? When were we attacked? Get the who, what, when, where, and this is all verifiable, right? These are actual facts that you can ascertain. Then you go to, okay, who's attacking Iran? Is it like some yahoos? Is it just Israel? Is it America? Is it the military? Is it a rogue military? Like, did the Gerald Ford commander just get like super antsy and decide to pull the trigger, or was it actually an order by the president down the chain of command? If it's that, then okay, legitimate authority, we've checked it. And then you say like, okay, what are we trying to do here? And that's where you go to the primary source documents. Has the Trump administration, not Trump on social media, but the Trump administration in its documents, actually articulated what they want out of Iran? And they have. Last February, President Trump signed the National Security Presidential Memorandum number 2. Number 2, his second national security memorandum was outlining America's policy on Iran. and it actually, he's less than a month into his second term. He's got his second executive statement on national security issues, and it's Iran. So if you want to get a sense of the priority of this regime on the Trump administration's radar, you have it right there. And he articulates a very clear policy. He articulates those three things: no nukes, no ballistic missiles, stop the proxy terror. It's very clear. Now, interestingly, in that memo, the Trump administration lays out roles for essentially a return to maximum pressure. So very sanction-based, economic statecraft, diplomatic statecraft, etc. Interestingly enough, the military option's not there. It's not to say it's not, but I mean, it's not articulated. There's no military option at that time. Roll the clock forward to the end of 2025, early 2026, you get the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy come out. In those documents, the Trump administration again articulates that Iran is the number one state sponsor of terror. They articulate that they are the leading cause for instability in the Middle East, at the same time that they're articulating a desire to draw down American presence in the Middle East and lean more into allied burden sharing, which, I don't know, allied burden sharing looks a lot like cooperative work with, say, the Arab countries and Israel. So when you start putting together these three primary source documents with the deontological just war criteria, I think a very comprehensive picture emerges in terms of what we're looking at here. Yeah. What we're looking at is a presidential administration that actually has thought through this. And if you read the national security strategy, it's pretty clear that they're thinking in classical just war theory in many respects, and they're taking a first principles approach to this. So it's pretty clear that this is actually influencing their thinking at some level. Maybe not the president's personally.
Listen, I agree 100% with what you're saying. You're a professor. Okay.
Well, but my point is, this is what I'm saying in the classroom.
This is what she's teaching.
I'm walking my students. I am walking my students through this, and one of the things I tell my students in my classes.
Keep it up.
Trying to cultivate an entire sort of cognitive structure here.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, it's great. Yeah. Keep doing what you're doing. Right. Yeah. Here's the problem. The problem is that President Trump has not, been able to, has not, I'm not going to say he hasn't, because I can sit down and I can watch Trump, and given my background and experience, I can read between the lines. I can listen to Secretary of War, and I can listen to CENTCOM, and I get it. I get the campaign I get all I need from in terms of, I'm not down in the weeds, but I can see the way the campaign is unfolding. I can read between the lines. The pastors and elders out at your church, they're not going to sit down and read the national security strategy in the United States. It's like, okay, now, okay, so, and all I'm saying about this is where there are advantages to Trump's style of rhetoric, or transactional. And I'm also fully aware that when Trump is talking, he's talking generally, but he's also talking to the Iranians. Okay, so what he says and the rhetoric he uses, I can tell he's sending a message, right? But what we don't have and what we could use is him sitting down in the Oval Office, and say, listen, Americans, and address the questions at a level that says, listen, when I say no endless wars, I'm not putting troops on the ground. This is what I meant in terms of regime change. This is why, as much as we would love the liberation of the Iranian people, we can't do that. The cost of that, for America, lives, we're not willing to do that. But we're going to try to establish conditions. It's like sitting that. The problem with Trump is that I think he's just unable rhetorically to do that. And that's a problem. because
nobody else. I think
nobody else can do that. It's like,
well, he leans on Secretary Rubio to do a lot of that. But
Rubio,
you're right, Keith. It's like at some level, the president has to be the person to put that message. But let me just return to a point that you made earlier, and that's the original question: is what do we do to help people cut through the noise of this? Now, you've just articulated what the president can do, and I agree with you on that. He can and he should. I mean, that's what the bully pulpit's for, after all. But the original question was, what can we do? And specifically in the local church. Now, for pastors and elders, this is where I would say, like, actually pastors, you might say, to your point, Keith, pastors aren't going to go read the national security strategy. No, they're not going to know to go read it. I would agree with that. But that's where I think conversations like this are important, because I would imagine a pastor listening to this now actually realizes that there's a national security strategy and they can go do it. I mean, that's why I link to those documents when I do my writing and publications. So I think, it's kind of like a all of the above approach. Like, you want that top down message from the president, and it's not going to happen overnight, but there has to be a cultivation of a certain culture of learning, culture of discussion in churches, in homes, in schools, in the university classrooms, where it's like, hey, we can jump off on this topic by saying, hey, I saw this on social media, but we have to cultivate a reaction or a response to, I saw this on social media, that looks and sounds like, okay, but what is known? What are the primary source documents that actually help us establish what is known? And then what are the ethical frameworks that we can bring to bear to help us understand that? And I would argue elders and pastors with their theological training, they're trained to do that. That's what they do all the time in sermon prep. We just have to say, like, hey, there's another set of documents you should consider when thinking through some of these pieces, and then and be ready to provide that input. But I mean, to give Tony and his crew a pat on the back, I think that's what you guys are trying to do with your center a lot, and I think that needs to be emphasized there.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like where I'll just put some names and faces out there that I don't want people to go to on issues like this. I don't want people to go listen to Phil Vischer, the VeggieTales guy, who's way more, got a huge platform though, because he made VeggieTales. But, he's one of those typical guys who's just probably
Bob and Larry never went to boot camp, man.
In the Jim Wallace sort of camp now.
Really?
But they're spouting.
You're kidding.
I think so, Tim, right? Wouldn't you think
yeah, totally. No, I totally agree.
To put him and his crew in that kind of camp, but they, it's like that can't be the source of our Christian theological reflection and also articulation from the pulpit on things like Iran, So yeah, I mean, we're trying. The VeggieTale. Oh yeah. Trust me. Yeah.
Yep.
I'm so glad I'm doing over this stuff. Honestly, so
and there are some online guys that do a better job than others, but there's just, and now this space is so saturated. I mean,
well, and the tough thing in the evangelical or just broader Protestant Christian discussion space, and again, this is where we've mentioned this many times, but this is where I think, Providence Magazine is carving out an important niche for itself. But you got to get that pastor audience reading the magazine. Well, I'm not sure they have it quite broken in there, but they should. But my point being is, a lot of times when you talk about Christians and politics in America, most of the commentary is focused on domestic politics. So the ability to think Christianly about international politics is
very difficult,
sorely underdeveloped.
Yeah,
and that's a second problem here. The first problem is just the general tenor and who the main drivers of conversation and who the influences are. Most of them don't have government experience. Some of them, even on the influencer class, some of them aren't even like pastors themselves. They're just spouting off and are self-proclaimed, lay
Experts or something.
preachers of some kind.
Yeah.
But then the secondary problem is, even among those with theological training, when they think politics, they immediately think domestic politics. They're not thinking about international politics. And so they often bring, and they might be really well versed on domestic politics, but then they try to map that onto international politics.
Yeah,
and
that's a good point.
that's
Good point.
problematic too.
That's a good point.
So there's very few
Mhm.
kind of like lay people in the church who have a grounding and background in international politics, foreign policy that can, really
plus
speak
one
into
of
this.
the-
But
This has been excellent. I do hope people will find this and we'll try and get it out there because, man, anyways, this is something that is, maybe it's irked me, especially as a veteran of a foreign war. I guess maybe it bothers you that much more, right, Keith? I don't know. I
Totally.
mean, it does, right?
I suppose I try to be as sort of like unemotional and cold and rational in discussing these matters. It's just the way I'm trained. I have enough analytic philosophy to make me dangerous, So be dispassionate, but this is personal. It's like I was 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines in 1979 when they took Marines.
Yeah.
I had friends killed in Beirut. It was.
Well, and I knew how many Iranian weapon systems were, even in my little district.
Oh yeah,
even in my little district.
Yeah, that's even before we get to Iraq. The IEDs killed thousands. I mean, it's like they're lowballing it. I mean, the penetrators that came in from Iraq is just it. After a while, it's like this is why I need the Augustine whispering in my ear, not implacable hatred, because you just hate these bastards. It's like look what you're doing to me. It's like So I try to keep it at a much more, but I have to confess. I mean, it's like it's been. I mean, this is not history for me. This is memory. It's like the younger guys, anybody under 40 or 50 or even 60. I remember the nightly Ted Koppel thing. I remember the hostage rescue. We got an interesting story about the hostage rescue that failed. It was like one dishonorable disaster after another, and then Beirut. It's like so I'm not dispassionate, but I don't think that's on the Iran thing, and that wasn't exactly what has motivated me to get into the whole just war thing. But well, thanks, fellas. This has been good.
Hey guys, before we sign off, Tim, anything you want to add here at the end before we sign off?
No, I honestly thank you guys for taking the time, and Anthony for bringing us on. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, we need to keep in touch, especially if you're interested in doing something with prophets, for sure.
Absolutely. Hey guys, I'm gonna wrap it up here. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and hope you will take a time to hit the subscribe button, leave a comment. All right, thanks everybody. God bless. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Please take a moment to leave a review on your podcast app of choice. If this episode made you think of someone you know, please share it with them. If you want to get in touch with the Kirkwood Center, you can call or text us at 909-493-7799 or send us an email at contact@kirkwoodcenter.org. You can also visit our website at kirkwoodcenter.org. If you want to join the theology and ethics conversation and see more content, you can find the Kirkwood Center on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube and Substack. Until next week, my name is Anthony Costello. Thank you for listening to the Kirkwood Center podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you. Until then, God bless.